Good afternoon. My name is Greg Herman. I'm the Deputy City Manager for the City of San Luis Obispo. Thank you for being here today. The city is committed to keeping the community informed, and we're happy to have the opportunity to share information about the recent protests in the city. We have 4 different speakers today. Our first speaker will be Deanna Cantrell, Police Chief of the City of San Luis Obispo. Our second speaker will be Mayor Heidi Harmon. Our third speaker will be Dr. Leola, Dublin, Macmillan, community leader. And our final speaker will be City Manager Derek Johnson. With that, I'm happy to hand it over to Chief Cantrell.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here today for such an important conversation. First, I just want to reiterate that I am appalled by the senseless death of George Floyd and what happened in Minneapolis last week. My thoughts are with his family and all of the families that have been affected by these tragic events. I also want you to know, and I feel like you do know this, that we support peaceful protests in San Luis Obispo, and we take very seriously everyone's First Amendment rights, all of the First Amendment rights of our community members. No police chief, no police officer, no community member wants what happened yesterday to happen. And I'm not talking about the protest. We get protests all the time. We've had many, many protests in San Luis Obispo that have been fantastic. We've had protests about injustice and intolerance and racism and human rights, and those protests have been amazing. But in large part, that is due to the community members that are involved in those protests, and they control how those events take place and the message that ends up coming from those events. And we had an amazing event and protest on Sunday, and all the thanks goes to the organizers of that event who worked incredibly hard to keep it peaceful, and they allowed even just a little bit of help from the police department to keep them safe so that they could protest and express themselves in a way that was really meaningful to them. The mission of the San Luis Obispo Police Department is to maintain a safe city, to provide public safety, to maintain a safe city by working in partnership with our community to protect everyone's lives and property, to prevent and reduce crime, and to improve the quality of life in San Luis Obispo. And I think we have done that over the last several years. We have been incredibly focused on that mission. I acknowledge that in many ways, this mission has never been more difficult, but it also has never been more important for us to partner together to face today's societal issues. I also have total confidence in my staff at the police department and in our community leaders to deliver on that mission, because I can't deliver on that mission alone. I can't accomplish that by myself or with just the police department staff. It is a collective effort for all of us that live in a community to make that mission a success. And I do have absolute confidence in our community leaders to make that happen. I want to go through the timeline of events from yesterday and the facts as I currently know them. And I say that because more information will come in over the preceding days, and the information I have today may change, but this is what I know today. The police department was made aware of yesterday's protest on Sunday afternoon. And we tried to reach the event organizers, although that was difficult. It was difficult to figure out exactly who was organizing it. It wasn't a specific group like Race Matters Slow or the NAACP. It was just kind of all over Facebook and Instagram and that kind of thing. So that was very difficult for us. So what we did is we reached out to our partners, to our community leaders, and asked them for their help in figuring out who was organizing it so we could reach out in advance like we always do and say, what can we do to help you be successful? So our community leaders did that. They reached out to as many organizers as they could figure out who it was. It provided them some mentoring and some counseling. I did not personally talk to any of them, any of the folks that were organizing yesterday's event. The protest started at Mission Plaza. It proceeded very quickly through downtown, out to Santa Rosa and towards the police department. We estimated about 1,500 to 2,000 people were present, at least initially. We had many, many warnings on social media about looting, we had many posts that the protest on Monday, yesterday, was not going to be peaceful. Specifically, there was one in particular that said it was time for an aggressive and violent demonstration. So it was a very different event that we were dealing with yesterday than what we dealt with Sunday or in all of our many, many protests that we've had in San Luis Obispo before. The march stopped at the intersection of Walnut and Santa Rosa, where officers and other law enforcement personnel knelt with the protesters in solidarity and in support of racial justice. And what we were trying to do is just make a line in front of Walnut, just so they couldn't be in front of the police department and block ingress and egress. We have emergencies all over the city. Our primary objective is public safety, and if we have a domestic violence call somewhere in the city, it would be a much longer response for us if we're coming from the police department, if we have people blocking our ingress and egress. So the purpose wasn't to stop them from protesting in front of the police department. They could, all they wanted. They just couldn't block Walnut, but they could be on Santa Rosa. So we only blocked Walnut from them. So the march stopped there. Officers dealt with them. At the same time, we had to prevent them from getting in front of our facility. They proceeded past our facility at some point and went down to Foothill in Santa Rosa, stayed there for a little bit, turned around, started heading back to downtown. Another large contingent of folks had joined them at that point, so it's still somewhere around the 1,500, 2,000 person mark, somewhere around there. When they were coming back, they were chanting about the freeway. CHP has very limited resources. CHP has sent much of their resources north to Sacramento and south to Los Angeles, and so they have very limited resources. We struggled to get enough resources in a line, but we got a line at the freeway to try to block any kind of freeway entrance. The group forced themselves past that line and ended up getting onto the highway. Our streets in our city are dangerous enough. We have pedestrians that are killed all the time by cars. And when it's not a planned protest, when we can't put up hard barricades, we try to leapfrog intersection to intersection to block, not to block people's right to protest, but to block cars from hitting people during their protest. And so getting on the freeway, our streets are dangerous enough, but our freeway is exponentially more dangerous. We have very short on and off ramps, a very limited view on and off ramps. And so to get on that freeway with vehicles going 70, 80 miles an hour is incredibly dangerous, not only for the protesters, but also for law enforcement and for the people. Imagine if you were the person driving a vehicle and hit somebody on the freeway, what that would do to you as well. So it's incredibly dangerous. They pushed through, they got on the freeway, we set up, CHP got the freeway traffic shut down, thank goodness. Nobody got injured on the freeway. We set up a very hard skirmish line at Marsh. The protesters were pushed towards that, and an announcement was given, a dispersal order was given at that point of an unlawful protest. We pushed them off the freeway at Marsh, and then they headed back downtown, and it wasn't very long before they were headed back down Santa Rosa towards the freeway again. So we set up a line at Walnut, and this was to prevent them from getting on the freeway again. A decision was made that there was a line in the sand there. It is far too dangerous for them to get on the freeway, and so we set up a line there to prevent them from getting on the freeway. At this point, it was about 6:08 p.m. This started at about 2 p.m. And so at about 6:08 p.m., we had formed a line on Walnut, and about 6:11 p.m., they formed a line, arm in arm, their own skirmish line, and started running down the hill towards our line. Officers donned all of their equipment. They put on gas masks in anticipation of deploying gas. They had helmets on, they had shields, and all of their equipment was donned at that point. All of the law enforcement resources in this county were exhausted. Everyone was here that was available. Everybody's units were here. That limits their own ability to provide public safety to their own cities because all of their resources were here. Our staff was physically exhausted. from being out in all of that gear. Try wearing all of this all day. And it's very hot, and it is exhausting. Our staff was exhausted. The sheriff's department had just driven back from LA. They had no rest in between. They were tired. We were headed into night. It was starting to get dark. It was going to get dark on us pretty soon. Getting on that freeway in the dark would be a terrible, terrible, dangerous idea. We had all of our resources in the entire city dealing with this. And so our ability to provide public safety for the rest of the city and the rest of the citizens was severely diminished. The dangers to the protesters and drivers was severe. And we had one protester that did collapse in the line. We broke the line. We went in, helped her, brought her out. San Luis Obispo Fire and Medical came and provided her medical assistance. It's important to know San Luis Ambulance is right down the street on Santa Rosa. And if they have a call downtown, they couldn't drive through Santa Rosa. They had to go all the way around to get there, which added a couple of minute response to anything that they were responding to. So there were a lot of factors that went into the decision to finally draw the line and say you can't get on the freeway. But what you can do is you can turn around and you can march throughout this city if you'd like. We will leapfrog, we will block intersections. That conversation was had with the leadership. Captain Smith from the police department was on scene. He talked to the leader, brought the leader through the skirmish line, and they talked, and he said, we're not trying to stop you. We are not trying to prevent you from protesting or getting your message out. What we are trying to do is protect you and protect the rest of the citizens in the city. All we're asking is you cannot get on the freeway and you cannot block the front of the police station. Other than that, turn around and march. Have your day. Say your piece. We're ready to hear it. And we largely do not disagree with you. That conversation was had. The leadership let us know that we were at an impasse, and that wasn't going to happen. So after 2 hours of staying there, we started giving a dispersal order. The dispersal order was given at 7:14 p.m. We did not start to move that crowd until 8:09 p.m. So almost an hour after the first dispersal order was given, the unlawful assembly order. Many people did disperse. Many people moved onto the sidewalk, but there were quite a few that did not. That resulted in us arresting about 4 people. I've lost myself in my notes, I'm sorry. So we gave a clear, detailed dispersal order. It was given numerous times. Protesters pushed through our line and ended up on the other side of Walnut, so they were on both sides of Walnut on Santa Rosa. So now we had people behind us, people in front of us. We had to split lines and split our resources, and so a decision was finally made to start moving the crowd back. At that point, we deployed pepper ball. It's little like a paintball, but it has pepper spray in it. We deployed those on the ground in front of people just to get them to start moving. As soon as that happened, bottles, rocks, fireworks, other objects started being thrown at law enforcement. And so we used an intervention method, which is tear gas. It was used to disperse the crowd. The purpose of that is because it requires no physical touching on the part of law enforcement. I don't have to touch you. You don't have to get injured. I'm not going to get injured. It goes out. It's irritating to folks, and they disperse. And that's exactly what happened. It was the safest way after many hours of negotiating with folks to have them be able to have their protest. We put tear gas out. The crowd did disperse. They ended up all throughout the city. And then after that, we ended up having a few issues at night. Our officers stayed on full deployment throughout the night. We responded to several incidents of businesses being vandalized and thefts in the downtown. The suspects for that have been arrested. We do have information for additional protests this week. There's potentially, we're hearing information, there may be one today. 2, we don't have credible information for that yet, so we're just waiting to figure out what's going to happen. We may have another one Thursday. I've reached out to the NAACP. We have a good relationship. We've talked. I've offered them our resources. I will block the road. They want to have a rally. They do not want to have a march. They would just like to have a rally. so the message can be heard and not lost. And so we are absolutely happy to help them with that if that takes place. I don't know if it's going to take place or not. Just to wrap it up, I know this city knows that we support your First Amendment rights. We've demonstrated it over and over and over again over the last several years, to your right to gather and express in a peaceful way. But what will not be tolerated by this police department or any police department in our county are actions of vandalism, unsafe behavior, damaging property, theft, arson, or any other acts of violence to people or property. So we ask you to please use this time to express your opinions in a peaceful way. So that's the end of mine, and I'm going to introduce our Mayor Heidi Harmon.
Thank you. Over recent days, thousands of people in our community and in our world have boldly stood in solidarity to protest racial injustice that has plagued our nation. And I stand with you and I hear you, and I want to take this opportunity to positively impact social change. A change that looks like centering Black voices, equity in leadership, and a world where parents don't live in fear when their Black children leave the house. And a San Luis Obispo that doesn't leave anybody out. We have heard over and over again at rallies and at marches that people of color do not feel welcome here. And it is time to step up and be willing to do the difficult and necessary work of changing that. We know it is up to us to do the work to educate ourselves in order to create a community that is welcoming, equitable, and kind. We've received many emails over the last 24 hours from community members asking us to set aside funding for meaningful diversity and anti-racism work. And I hear you. And in my position of leadership and in my privilege as a white ally, I will be advocating for funding to go directly toward policy and efforts to better serve communities of color and create more equity here in San Luis Obispo. At tonight's City Council meeting, I will be asking for $100,000 to be set aside and designated now and to be used immediately towards meaningful efforts to create a city in which tear gas will never be used. And I hope that my colleagues will join me in supporting that. A budget is a reflection of our values, and I want this San Luis Obispo budget to show our commitment to anti-racism work. And I call on the white community here to do the work, to show up and to show up in many ways, including funding the efforts of those organizing locally and across the nation to bring to fruition true and lasting systemic change. For resources to learn about and support the work of local folks here in San Luis Obispo, please go to Race Matters SLO County, the SLO County chapter of the NAACP, and the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at Cal Poly, amongst others. There's no doubt that all that's been happening in the country and in our own community have unearthed so many feelings for so many of us. And if you find yourself in crisis, please contact the San Luis Obispo County Behavioral Health Access Line at 1-800-838-1381 or the 24/7 SLO hotline at 1-800-783-0607. I implore you that as we move forward into tomorrow and the weeks and the years to come, to listen, to ask questions, and to learn, and to join me in doing the difficult work that lies before us. Do not look away. We are a caring and compassionate community, and we are a caring and compassionate community of privilege. And we are called to use that privilege to create a more fair and just world for everyone. A world can exist where we no longer have to protest injustice because injustice no longer permeates our country. A world where riot gear goes rusty and policing becomes obsolete. A world where Black men run and Black women sleep in their homes safely. A world where George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery are still alive, leading us forward. So let's please create that world together. And now it is an honor to introduce community leader, Dr. Leola Dublin Macmillan.
Thank you, Mayor Harmon. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Leola Dublin Macmillan. I'm a San Luis Obispo resident, and a community activist, and an educator. And I want to be clear that I'm here today, and I'm not representing law enforcement, and I'm not representing the city of San Luis. I'm here as a Black woman who lives in the city of San Luis, and I'm here because I believe in the possibility of San Luis becoming a just and inclusive community. For those of you who are familiar with the work that I've been doing in this county for years, you have heard me speak about Dr. Martin Luther King's notion of the beloved community. In the beloved community, people live without fear. Beloved communities thrive, they flourish, they're just, they're equitable, they're inclusive. We can have that in San Luis Obispo. We absolutely can. There is no reason that we don't. We have the resources here, human and financial, that we need. We absolutely have that. We have brilliant people. We have passionate people. We have compassionate people. We have what we need. We need courage. We need strong leadership. We need coalition work. We need all of us to put our differences aside and focus on a common goal. We have the opportunity at a very pivotal moment in American history to make our city a national model for how to do it right. We can do that. There are amazing people in this town. There are amazing people in this room. Amazing people have been at this podium. I encourage everyone, continue to advocate for Black and brown liberation. Continue to fight for justice. Continue to fight to dismantle structural inequality. But make sure our actions are effective. Make sure they're strategic. I'm asking everyone in this community to join me. It's hard work. It's soul-crushing work. It took a horrifying murder that many of us watched to start a national conversation that is long overdue. Please don't let us lose this momentum. We can't afford to. We have everything we need. We are everything that we need. We can do this right. We must. We owe it to ourselves. We owe it to our community. We owe it to every person in this country who has lost their lives because of the color of their skin, because of their immigration status, because of their sexual orientation. We owe it to ourselves. We have to be better than this. We are better than this. We need to show that we are better than this. I'm going to close with something my students hear me say all the time. I love you. I'm glad you're in the world. Be safe, make smart choices, and let's get together and do the heavy lifting. We can build and sustain a beloved community in San Luis Obispo. That time is right now. We cannot wait. Thank you, and good afternoon. Sorry, I forgot. I'm so embarrassed. It is my pleasure to introduce our city manager, my friend Derek Dreamboat Johnson. Derek.
Well, I do want to thank the mayor and Dr. Macmillan and Chief Cantrell. I do want to thank everyone for coming today, and to the community members who have peacefully participated in a series of protests in the city since last week. You know, I've been honored to bear witness to a powerful group of speakers who have talked about the cries for justice following the unjustified killing of George Floyd. And those cries have been heard throughout our community, along with the cries that have been expressed throughout our nation. Just want to emphasize that our community supports and our city supports peaceful protests and the expressions of the fundamental rights to free speech. It's normal, and expected that peaceful protests can be filled with strong emotion and strong language. And as we've experienced here in our community, and people have expressed deep pain over the death of George Floyd and the historical references of injustice and racism. I also have a responsibility in this community to make sure that it's safe and that our employees maintain that community in a safe manner. I support the measured actions taken by our police officers and our public safety partners as necessary under the circumstances. And I ask that everyone that is planning to protest do so in a safe manner to ensure that everyone's voice is heard in this important time. This is an important point in our history. We have to make sure that all voices are heard and it's not marred by anything else. As was said earlier, yesterday was an unplanned protest with persons from throughout the region. Many were clearly unfamiliar with the city. They walked down streets, they entered the freeway against traffic, sometimes walking towards moving semi-trucks and moving towards fast vehicles. Over the course of nearly 6 hours, our officers protected protesters who did not have a plan as they entered Highway 101. I'm glad to say that fortunately no one was hurt as protesters marched from street to street. And I'm very pleased that our law enforcement personnel kept in close contact with marchers. It was really through the quick planning and the leadership of our public safety staff that no one was hurt. We have voiced strong opinions as our community in the past with respect to humility and compassion. We can do it again. Our community has a strong commitment towards social equity, inclusion, and safety. And as we actively support unity, and we actively support unity and dialogue. And we want to move this forward as key values in our community. The City of San Luis Obispo will continue to reaffirm the rights and values of peaceful, thoughtful, meaningful protest as a way to share our feelings about issues and events. In solidarity and to bring comfort to our community during this difficult time, we stand here together and remind everyone that we are strong, we are resilient, and we are compassionate, and we are San Luis Obispo. So I just want to remind everyone, and I appreciate everyone in chambers today, donning masks that as we still have a pandemic in our county. I want to continue to encourage that people participating in those protests protect themselves against COVID-19, that they wear the appropriate face coverings and maintain physical distance. And so with that, I'll wrap up my comments and we'll be available to answer any questions.
Question for anyone from the city. Was there any I'm Dave Alley with KCOY. Any thoughts of entertaining a curfew? We've seen this in neighboring communities, certainly Santa Maria, other communities throughout the United States. Any thoughts of that to try and prevent something like this from happening again?
Great question. So the question was asked, is there any plans for any curfew? We've certainly taken that under advisement where we monitored the events from last night. We'll be evaluating what happens today. And then ultimately the authority for making that decision is specified under the city municipal code, provides that authority to the city manager. And so I'll be evaluating both today and tonight and then making a decision as needed.
I have a question for you. You mentioned earlier that no one was hurt with the use of tear gas and such, but I've spoken with a couple of people who say they were hit by riot rounds. Is that true?
If people say that they were, then they may have been. The pepper ball rounds were shot at folks that were throwing rocks and other projectiles at law enforcement. And so they very well could have been struck by It's like a paintball, but nothing has been reported to us that I'm aware of.
I've talked with a few people that were actually just media that say that they were hit, specifically aimed at.
Specifically what?
Aimed at. They were standing near the crowd and they said that they were hit by the rounds.
So the statement is that you've talked to the media that said they were specifically aimed at.
Multiple people that were just standing there were hit by the rounds is what I'm saying.
Yeah, we don't have a report of who was hit by the rounds. We did fire the rounds at people that were throwing projectiles at us, and if there was anyone near them that was throwing projectiles at us, one of those pepper balls may have hit somebody else.
Thank you.
Yeah.
In terms of trying to just de-escalate overall, I guess two-part question: why the riot gear, and then could you have done more to try to talk to these leaders, maybe prolong the conversation instead of going to tear gas and the weapons?
So the question is why the riot gear and why the tear gas, or could we have done something else? You know, it's a delicate balance, the riot gear is. We know that visually it's insightful to people that are protesting. We wait until the last minute, but the problem is, as you've seen in many other cities, you've seen lots of law enforcement, even one of the horses that got hit by a brick, the injuries that are sustained by people from things that are being thrown at them. And so do you wait until one of you is hit, which I know for all of my staff, none of them would like to volunteer to be the first one to be struck by something before they don their gear, or at the very tipping point when you think this could get violent, do you don that gear then? And so, you know, the best that we can do is to don it at the very tipping point where we think that we're going to need it. And we understand the impact that it has on protesters, but we also have to be safe ourselves. And we can't provide for public safety when there's none of us to provide it. So that's the answer for the riot gear. As far as the gas goes, you know, Nick, we waited a long time and we negotiated a whole lot and we gave lots and lots of options. And the options were not, you stop this protest right now. The options were protest, let your voice be heard. You just can't do it on the freeway, and you just can't do it in front of the police department. The rest of the city, go for it. And that wasn't taken. It was getting dark, people were exhausted, one of them was injured. I went over the laundry list of reasons that went into that decision to finally do something and have to push the crowd back. And so that did not come lightly. That decision didn't come lightly. It's a heavy, heavy burden to have to make that decision and know the impact that it's going to have on not only your own staff, but on a community that normally loves you, that's going to be very mad at you.
And moving forward, I mean, do you think that there's a way to reach some of the folks that you weren't able to reach yesterday? And are those efforts being made to try to talk to some of those folks?
Oh yeah, I think so. You know, Dr. Macmillan, Leola talked about it, that we can't do this alone. And the more we separate, the more that we divide, the worse this is going to get. And I will always, for as long as I'm in this profession, even when I'm not, I will always work to build those bridges and those relationships because we have to have them. And so that work won't stop. That work will continue with yesterday's protesters and with any in the future.
Do you think the vandalism was connected to the march, or was it separate?
You know, I don't know if it was just opportunistic it was young kids, if it was 4 young kids that were just taking an opportunity, or if they were at the protest and it was tied to it to make a statement. I don't know.
Dave Middlecamp with the Tribune. I had trouble hearing both the police announcements over the PA. Helicopter was flying overhead, airplane was flying overhead, and I heard people on the protest side 2 or 3 rows back going, "What did he say? What did he say?" They didn't understand what was going on.
We called for the helicopter to move out, and it did. We called for the plane to move out, and it did. And then we used a bullhorn, and I think we announced 8 different times at least, and have the conversations directly with the leaders who I know were having the conversations in the crowd with folks. I know that was happening. So one-on-one conversations for those who might not have been able to hear it, but we certainly tried everything that we could to make sure everybody heard that announcement and gave ample time, an hour, to disperse.
If you could, what's the status of the people that were arrested at the protest last night? Have they been released?
That's a good question. Do any of you know that? Any of the police staff in the back? Were the people that were arrested yesterday, the four, were they released?
I would assume based on the jail
Yeah.
COVID response, I don't think anyone was kept in custody.
Yeah, I would assume that as well. I can't tell you that positively, but my absolute assumption would be that they were.
And if protests continue this week, are there plans at the police department to continue arresting people, or?
The plan is the same as it always is to provide for public safety for all of the protesters that are protesting, to let them have their First Amendment rights to freedom of speech and to do that peacefully, and then to weigh all of the many, many pieces of that puzzle to figure out at what point does it become unlawful or dangerous or unsafe to the point that we have to have some intervention. That will always be the plan.
Chief, when the protesters say it's their First Amendment, and you certainly agree with that, does that give them the right to march through city streets basically indefinitely for hours upon hours on any street they want and just kind of congregate, sit down, what we saw yesterday?
That's a good question. The question is, when folks protest, and we do respect their First Amendment rights, does it give them a right to walk through the streets indefinitely? And the answer to that is no, it doesn't. Quite frankly, they can't even take the streets in the first place. But law enforcement isn't going to immediately, the moment 1,000 people take to the street, start jumping in riot gear and shoving them back on the sidewalk. It's unrealistic. We know that's not going to work, and it's just going to be dangerous for everybody. And so that's why we allow it. Law enforcement all over the nation allows it to a degree. And for every single city, every community has a different tipping point. When looting or fires or destruction of property, when those things are going to be decision points for law enforcement leaders that are in a command post to decide, okay, how far do we let this go? How far do we let this go? How much staff do we have? What are our resources? How depleted are they? How many people are there? All of those things go into those decisions. But the short answer is no.
And so last night when you finally decided to disperse the crowd, was there one tipping point?
Well, it was all those. I think I listed those out pretty clearly.
It wasn't one specific, it just kind of culminated into...
It was a culmination of lots of things. Yes?
Do you have any idea what the size of the force was last night that was responding and all the agencies that were involved?
Yes. Initially, we had about 100, and that was with allied agencies. I think San Luis Obispo had somewhere around 30 or 35. And then we had numerous folks from other agencies, and then we did have to call for more assistance. CHP asked for officers to come from King City and from Santa Maria, and so CHP responded from that far away, and the county had a large contingent of deputies that had just come back from Los Angeles, so we're driving up, and they joined forces, and so I think by the end of it, we had somewhere around 130.
And was there a reason you felt like you guys needed such a large force?
Yeah, well, I mean, it sounds large. It sounds large to someone that might not see all of it happening, but the reality is we have small groups, so we have groups of about 10 or so. There was a very large contingency at the courthouse. That's the sheriff's department is responsible for security at the courthouse, and so they had a very large contingent that staged and stayed at the courthouse and didn't leave. And then we have certain areas that we were protecting, such as the police department. We had staff inside the police department. We certainly couldn't allow it to be looted or caught on fire or something of that nature, which we've seen. And so that takes a lot of people in one line. If you look at any of the photos or video from last night, just one line of officers across the street is 30. It took 30 officers side by side to stretch across. And so two sides is 60. And that doesn't include covering the 4 on-ramps to the freeway that are right there, and other area security, and dealing with all the other emergencies in the city that are happening. So 130 sounds like a lot, but it's not.
For the 4 that were arrested, are they from SLO County?
Yes.
I also have a question for Mayor Harmon.
Yeah, are there any other questions for me? Let me just finish up and then, okay.
In terms of just use of force in this particular situation, do you plan to release any body cam footage from the events? Is that something that you're willing to do?
We will follow our body worn camera policy that we currently have in place as a city. Did you have one?
Yeah, I have heard from just like random people on social media that shots were fired. Would that be the pepper balls?
Shots were not fired. There were no firearm, anything like that. The pepper balls were fired, and there were a lot of firecrackers and fireworks, and there were some M80s that were thrown at law enforcement, and that could very much sound like, potentially sound like firearms.
Okay, so there weren't like rubber bullets or anything?
No, we don't have rubber bullets. We have something called a 40 millimeter. It's a foam, maybe about as big around as this microphone or something. There's some 40 millimeter rounds. I think a couple of those were fired at people that were throwing rocks at officers. And I think there were, I don't know what agency it was, but I think one agency might have fired a couple of beanbag rounds. It's like a little beanbag that's in a shotgun round. So it's all less lethal. There was no lethal firearms that were fired.
After the tear gas was shot off, what happened? Because I was there and I noticed the majority of the people were running away.
Yeah.
So were people still staying there? Because I heard a second round go off and then people were getting shot by the rounds.
So the question is, what happened after the tear gas? So what happened was people started to disperse and then they stopped. If you were there, you saw that. So they stopped on Santa Rosa and there was a line of officers that had moved forward and there was a line of protesters. And so it wasn't until then that the tear gas was deployed, because there's a long distance between us, and typically that's what we try to do. And so the tear gas was deployed. Some of the canisters were thrown back at law enforcement. So even in some of the video, you can see the canisters of tear gas that were at the law enforcement officers within their ranks. Once the tear gas was deployed, more people started to disperse, and a group of people had come around on a side street and flanked the officers and threw M80s at them and started throwing rocks. And so the groups ended up splitting, but that's where rocks and some of that other stuff was thrown for groups that kind of split off and then came back around.
In terms of the bottles, do you know if they were glass or plastic?
I think they were water bottles. What kind of bottles? I think they were water bottles. Is that right?
A variety of different things.
Were fireworks?
Variety of, yeah.
Were fireworks thrown at the officers?
Fireworks were in M80s were thrown at them.
what are M80s?
It's a explosive device. It's a pretty strong explosive device. It's a pretty strong, we call it a firecracker, but it's much more than a little tiny firecracker. Okay.
Chief, question. There was a lot of strong language directed towards law enforcement last night. Your officers, sheriff deputies there. Strong language on signs directed towards law enforcement. And then there was the deployment of the tear gas, the bullets, etc. So combining all those elements, how fearful are you that whatever goodwill the police department here in San Luis Obispo had prior to last night, has been, irrevocably jeopardized?
I hope, so the question is, how fearful am I that all of the good work that has been done over the many years has been jeopardized? I think with some people it may be, but I think if people are willing to have difficult conversations and come to the table and sit down and talk about both sides, if we are willing as law enforcement to listen to the needs of the community and to protesters, and we do understand right here and what that does, and we try hard not to don it until we are afraid we're going to get injured. And so, we are very mindful of all of that. People may not realize it, but we are. And I think as long as law enforcement leadership is willing to sit down and sit at the table and have these conversations and change where we can. We've changed policies, we have lots of de-escalation training, we have mindfulness, we have principal policing, we have done training in implicit bias to teach ourselves and to understand our role in this world and with society, and that at the very heart of our role in this world is the sanctity of human life. That doesn't just happen. That happens because we have relationships with marginalized community members and we listen. But at the same time, we have community members that listen to how difficult and how complex our job is. And so I think we have, as Dr. Macmillan said, we have everyone here. We can do the work, and it's difficult, soul-crushing work. But we do have people that are willing to engage, and I think the vast majority of our community is still willing to, as am I. I will never give up on it. And I think some people will, but I certainly hope we haven't lost too much ground. Okay, I'm going to give up the mic.
I know you mentioned that you don't want the police to use tear gas. What do you think a better alternative is as far as breaking crowds up?
So I don't have that level of expertise to fully offer a suite of alternative solutions. And what I was saying is, if I could go back to my notes, that we have a lot of, what I'm really interested in and committed to is doing the work that both the chief and Dr. Macmillan and Derek, and I think everyone in this room, and hopefully everyone in this community, we need to do the work to create a community in which that doesn't ever become necessary. And I feel like that's where I can play a role. So also I think what is helpful to clarify, and Derek spoke to it briefly, but myself and my colleagues on council are the policymakers of the city. We are not the ones that facilitate operations here at the city. That's the kind of the difference between my role and Derek's role. So we have an opportunity through policy and and procedures and budgeting, as I mentioned in my comments, to hopefully create a way to ensure that people are feeling heard, seen, and truly meaningfully supported, so that we can avoid these situations altogether. So that's where I feel like I can make the biggest difference, I'm hoping. Any other questions for me?
So just to follow up on that a little bit.
Yeah.
You know, do you think it can be done where there's these other options aside from tear gas? I mean, do you think personally, just on, how you feel about it, that tear gas should not be used as a human rights issue, or?
Well, I think that obviously nobody wants to be using tear gas. I mean, obviously last night was very upsetting for everyone in this community. I'm processing the whole thing myself. And so I try and be really careful about not speaking to what I'm not well enough informed enough on yet. But I am committed to learning more and hearing what those options might be. I think that, de-escalating is something that comes up a lot, of course. I've already sent to the chief, I don't know, it was a series of maybe 20 plus questions that I believe originated with Black Lives Matter, questions to basically going over her policies to see what those are, and with the potential opportunity of policy shifts that might be able to be made there, which is, as I mentioned, my role. So I think it looks like a lot of things, I don't have the expertise in terms of real specifics on specific alternatives, except for obviously creating a community where people feel heard in the first place. I think to me that seems like the alternative that we're hopefully all here to really start meaningfully doing.
Just one more follow-up,
Sure.
Heidi. So for you just personally as mayor, and then also somebody who's sympathetic, obviously, to the injustices, how do you feel about this whole situation right now? Are you conflicted about safety versus the right to protest?
Man, I haven't slept. I've just been thinking so much about exactly how do I feel? What is the right thing here? And, it's so easy to get wrapped up in any one individual story and think, oh my God, they're absolutely correct. This is this. And then you hear from another person's point of view. And you hear all the complexities of what it is to create public health and safety. You know, and I know that the chief has shared that her number one job is that, protecting public health and safety. And there are folks, for obvious reasons, who feel like policing as a systemic institution is not the institution they look to for protecting public health and safety, right? So we have these really big challenges. So I feel, the thing that seems the hardest is just the amount of division and divisiveness in our country in general. And so that's just been ramping up and ramping up and ramping up. Obviously, COVID seemed to, from my perspective, really amplify that division. And then now we have this challenge of trying to engage on the sort of deepest, one of the original sins of this country that has never, ever been healed. And so at a time where we have more division than ever, at a time where we have people coming to events like we had, and I'm not saying this actually took place at our event, but it's been known to happen throughout the country with the express purpose of agitating that event to create more division between races, right? There's a lot of complexities happening. And so from my perspective, there's a lot of hurting and a lot of pain and a lot of major challenges that we have, you know? We're in the middle of this unprecedented pandemic at a time where, you know, climate crisis, I think, is also about to really smack us in the face, and we've never dealt with racial injustice in this country. And so now all of these things are happening at once. And we're really ill prepared to really step up in a way that is strong and is bold and is courageous and is also willing to listen and learn. So to me, I think that's the hardest part. You know, a lot of people have been attacking me over the last 24 hours, and I get the frustration totally. And so I would just like to invite those folks, like I would be 100% willing to have an open-hearted, open-minded dialogue where I do all the listening. We can have hopefully a conversation about what needs to happen next.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So,
I think Dr. McMillan.
Can Dr.
Oh, sorry.
McMillan- Yeah.
Thanks for indulging me. This is not scripted. I'm thinking about the questions that folks here have been asking, and I have a question for you, particularly the folks in the media. What have you been doing to amplify your platform, your power? What have you been doing to help, right? Because it's fine that you can be behind a camera and ask leaders about the decisions they make and how they justify their actions. But most of you, I visually would race as white. What are you doing? How are you leveraging your privilege to help our community? Simply recording isn't enough. As I said earlier, this work is difficult and it requires all of us. When you come with the questions, make sure you're doing some really necessary interrogation. I'm glad that you marched. Is this the first time that you've marched? Have you been doing anti-racist work all of your life? Do you always intervene when people do stuff that you know is wrong? If you're not going to answer yes, if you can't answer yes, nobody can point a finger. All of us have to do this work. All of us. No finger pointing. All of us. All of us.
So I'd like to thank you all for coming today, and thank you to all of our speakers. More information and updates are available regularly at www.slowcity.org, and that concludes today's press conference. Thank you.